the question we decided to ask was this: if it's a system for binding information together, then if we study binding, then this is a way of studying the episodic buffer. It turns out that there is also a lot of work on binding in visual memory. And if I might just take a sidestep there, because one interesting feature of the visuospatial sketchpad is that we started to study it using quite a complex task, visual imagery. We didn't, as in the case of the phonological loop, start at the bottom. Interestingly, in the last few years, there's been some really excellent work on the more basic aspects of visual and visuospatial memory, principally by people who originally worked on visual attention. And they were very interested in how information is bound in vision. If you look at the way in which the visual system works, it splits a visual image into separate components, a colour, a shape, brightness, movement, and processes them separately. But what we see is an object in which these are brought together again. So the crucial question is, how does this bringing together, this binding occur? And so one of the areas that we chose to look at binding was in this visual processing situation. However, we wanted to be broader than that, and we also looked at binding in verbal memory. Here we looked at the way in which a sequence of words, if it's in a sentence, can be bound together into chunks. So we know that if we're trying to remember unrelated words, we can remember about 5, maybe 6. If it's a sentence you take from the newspaper, then it's probably 15. So what makes the difference? Well, at one level we know it's that you can chunk the words into, first of all, meaning. You can use grammar and common phrases. And so 15 words you can probably boil down to maybe 4 chunks. But how are things bound into the chunks? Well, maybe in the episodic buffer. So we've done a whole series of experiments, both visual and verbal, in which we interfere with different aspects of the working memory system. When we first created the idea of an episodic buffer, we suggested that it was entirely controlled by the central executive. This was a hypothesis which we proposed, and we thought, well, we will only add other links if they're necessary. And we thought we can test this by trying to block the various components, and if we're right, then blocking the central executive should cause chaos in binding. And we've done that in visual and sentence memory. What we find is that binding itself does not appear to depend on the executive or the subsystems. Overall level of performance does, but the binding seems to go on off stage, so to speak. So we think of the items of when we see a colour and a shape bound together, that action there is done not on the episodic buffer, but perhaps within the visuospatial sketchpad, perhaps even more peripherally, but that it's projected, if you like, onto what we now think of as a passive screen. An important one, just as the screen of a computer is important, but it doesn't actually do the binding itself. So if you interfere with any of the subsystems, you'll interfere with overall performance, but you won't differentially disrupt binding. So we've now got a new version that actually sees the episodic buffer as a passive store that is fed by a stream of information from the visuospatial sketchpad, which in turn is fed from vision, spatial, kinesthetic, the phonological loop, which in turn is fed through sound, through language, probably through sign language, and probably also through smell and taste that feed directly onto it. So that raises the question of how do you rehearse in the episodic buffer? And here I think probably you maintain attention and you refresh the representation, which probably does depend on long-term memory and on the earlier stages of working memory. So this is a new theory. It's an old theory of working memory that's gradually grown, and this last version is within the last 6 months. So it's very new.